Now entering our story, one of the most interesting personalities in the history of the comic book medium, Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson, who was born in 1890 in Greeneville, Tennessee. At the age of 4, however, his father died and his mother moved the family to New York City. I'm not sure how many Tennessee connections that he kept, but I do know that he eventually became a cavalry officer. And in 1917 was part of the cavalry expedition led by John Blackjack Pershing in the American Southwest along the Mexican border, pursuing Pancho Villa. And later on, not very much later on at all, was in World War I, at which point he was the youngest major in the U.S. Cavalry. He became a major at the age of 27. So he fought through the war. After the war, he got into a bit of a controversy, sort of a very public argument with one of the guys in charge at West Point, and the major published an open letter criticizing the West Point administration, and in 1922, that led to the end of his military career at the age of 32. So, from there, he became a writer, initially writing books about military tactics and military history. He wrote a history, for example, of the cavalry. But he also started turning his attention to fiction. In particular, he started writing for pulp fiction magazines, mostly historical fiction, military-centered stuff, and westerns, and some mysteries. He also wrote several novels that were published by Street and House, who were one of the pulp fiction magazine publishers. He also ventured out in the 1920s into the world of writing comic strips. He wound up doing a comic strip adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, in which he was the scripter. In the fall of 1934, initially out of a desire to syndicate his own work and try to get it into newspapers, Wheeler-Nicholson established a company called National Allied Publications. But once he got underway with that and just sort of became aware of how successful the first few issues of Max Gaines's famous funnies was, he saw that there was an opportunity, there was a whole new market opening up for this whole comic book business, beyond just comic strips. So he decided that he would try to embark on a venture in comic book world, but he quickly found out that all of the really popular comic strips had essentially already been kind of gobbled up so far as reprint rights in comic books. So he decided to go in a different direction. Since he wasn't able to get the rights to any popular comic strips, Wheeler-Nicholson decided that his comic book would be all original material. Now, there had been some scattered original material in some of the other comic books that had been produced the previous year, but they were used as filler. There was only a little bit of it. Now, that 1929 Funnies thing was different, but as we established, that wasn't a comic book. So, New Fun Comics was going to be all original stuff. Initially, a lot of it was written by Wheeler-Nicholson himself, including a Western strip called Jack Woods. After a few issues, the name was changed from New Fun Comics to More Fun, and then More Fun Comics, and that's the name that it had for several years thereafter. A lot of the writers and artists that Wheeler-Nicholson hired to provide work for New Comics and later More Comics were people that were hoping to break into the comic strip business, the newspaper comic strip, and were using comic books as maybe a way to get started. Maybe they had some strip ideas that no newspapers or certainly no syndicates had picked up. A couple of individuals that he had working for him were the artist and writer team, or I should say the writer and artist team of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. And they had a couple of different titles running in New Fun / More Fun, starting with Henri Duval, which was about a musketeer, and also a mysterious, quote, ghost detective, Dr. Occult. Now, he was not a detective who was a ghost. He was a ghostbuster type detective. Siegel and Schuster were both about 21 years old at this point. They were from Cleveland. They had met in high school. They were both sons of Jewish immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe. And they had several ideas that they hoped to shop around and get a newspaper deal for, but this is how they got their start in New Fun Comics. Later that year, Wheeler-Nicholson put out a second title, initially called New Comics. After a few issues, it was changed to New Adventure Comics, and with issue 32 in 1938, just plain Adventure Comics. Now, if you're a longtime comics fan, if you're, say, my age or maybe close to it, you will recognize that logo, perhaps. So by 1936, Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson and National Allied Publications had 2 comic book titles, each with all original material, and he had an idea for a third that would only feature stories about detectives that he would call Detective Comics. But he had a problem. Problem was he wanted to launch a third book, and he was really having a hard time. He would have had a hard time just keeping one book afloat, to be honest. He was losing money, hand over fist. Sales were not going well. Now, New Fun Comics / More Fun, another difference that they had was that they had advertising, paid advertising, which is different from the previous ones. They had sponsors, but the whole book was sponsored by one company, like Procter & Gamble or Canada Dry. So he was actually selling ads, or trying to. He wasn't selling many, and he wasn't getting much money for it because his circulation was not very big, because people weren't buying the book, because it was all new material and no one had ever heard of any of the characters. See, the reason that Max Gaines's books perhaps were doing so well is that they were sort of recycling, reprinting the stories of characters that people already knew, right? Mutt and Jeff appeared on a lot of early covers of those Max Gaines books. And Wheeler-Nicholson didn't have that. And he was having trouble paying his own bills. He was having trouble paying his writers and artists on time, if at all. So if he was going to keep his operation afloat, let alone expand it, he was going to need some investors. And that's how he came into the orbit of these 2 guys, Harry Donenfeld and Jack Leibowitz. So let's back up a little bit now and get up to speed on who these guys were. Let's start with Harry Donenfeld. Harry Donenfeld was a Jewish immigrant to the United States. He was born in 1893 in Romania. His family immigrated when he was 5 years old. They came through Ellis Island and wound up living in the Jewish neighborhood in the Lower East Side of New York. Now, Harry, who had several brothers, had brothers and sisters, but he had 3 brothers who ran a printing business. that he initially didn't want anything to do with. Harry was what some people might call a fast talker, which is to say that he had the gift of gab. He was very gregarious. He had a larger-than-life persona, and perhaps not surprisingly, started life as a salesman, a clothing salesman, when he was in his early 20s. Married a young woman named Gussie, who came from a fairly well-to-do family that were able to set the young couple up, and Donenfeld got his own clothing store in 1918. However, when the economy had a downturn at the end of World War I, he lost his business in 1921, wound up having to go to work in the family printing business with his brothers. He didn't really know that much about the printing business. In fact, he didn't know a whole lot about business, to be honest. He was, well, like I say, he was a character. He was flamboyant. He knew how to talk people into things, and talk his way into things, and talk his way out of things. And pretty quickly, he started to make connections when he was in this printing business. You see, this was during the time of Prohibition. It had just gone into effect, in fact, when he lost his clothing store. And he set up an operation to transport cheap pulp paper from Canada. And the story goes, there were other things being transported from Canada as well. Canada, of course, it was still legal to make and sell alcohol. So bootlegging, he made connections with the mob, with gangsters. In fact, he was very well connected, and pretty quickly that started to impact the family business in a good way. They got some very lucrative printing contracts from the Hearst family, William Randolph Hearst. They printed magazines such as Cosmopolitan. And eventually, Donenfeld was able to finagle things to the point that he had the money and he had the leverage to take over the company from his brothers. So he forced two of them out and kept one on to run the printing stuff, because he didn't really know about the printing stuff. And then he was off to the races, as it were. Now, you might think that entering the shadowy world of the mob and bootlegging and everything, and then that leading to Donenfeld getting lucrative, high-end contracts with people like William Randolph Hearst, would lead him toward the pursuit of a more of an appearance of respectability. But you would be incorrect, because in 1925 he entered into a business relationship with this guy, Frank Armour of San Francisco. They were roughly the same age. They were in their early 30s at this time. This is a picture of Armour from later in life. Armour had, after World War I, he had wound up as, in his late 20s, working as an assistant director in Hollywood. And he worked with people like Rudolph Valentino and Gloria Swanson. In 1922, Armour parlayed his Hollywood experience into the publishing world. He put out a fan magazine called Screenland. Well, not so much a fan magazine. There were movie magazines had become really, really popular, and most of them were published by some of the pulp houses in the East in New York. Armour was coming from the other coast. The magazine he had was, quote, made where the movies are made, and he had inside information or at least that's how it was presented. He also personally led a very bohemian, Hollywood-like lifestyle. So he started putting this magazine out in 1922, and that's how he met Harry Donenfeld, right? Because if you publish a magazine, you have to have a printer. And before long, with this new business relationship between the two of them, Armour was expanding into new directions. The genre was called girly magazines. Now, this is before Playboy that came out in the 1950s. So we're talking the 1920s. These magazines initially were presented with sort of the appearance of being high culture and artistically oriented. Artists and models was the name of one. Gay Paris was the name of another. But the stories were kind of borderline salacious, and there was inside the covers, sometimes on the covers, lots of partial nudity and sometimes full nudity. Sometimes, like I said, sort of artistically staged so that things are draped, but then sometimes right there in the open. These were often sold from under the counter at newsstands. Later on, some other magazines that sort of ventured farther and farther away from the even the pretense of being artistic. Things such as these, particularly Pep. So you can see the sort of things that were being focused on here. And Donenfeld and Armour were working together on this, and a lot of times the name of the publishing company would change every issue or two because they were sort of trying to stay one step ahead of the Vice Squad in some cases. Sometimes the newsstand owners who sold this stuff got arrested for indecency. Sometimes there were crackdowns, and the publishers and printers would have to promise to behave themselves more, which means that they developed more subterfuge in getting stuff out, and then eventually went back to doing it the way that they originally had. By 1932, Armour was deeply in debt and was behind on his payments to the printing company, and that resulted in Donenfeld buying him out. Took over his publishing part of the operation as opposed to just the printing part, and Armour then became Donenfeld's employee instead of his client. So with Armour basically running the publishing venture, Donenfeld steered them toward kind of a slightly new approach, kind of a melding of girly magazines and pulp fiction, the spicy line of pulp fiction magazines, as you can see here. So that's the sort of stuff that Donenfeld was involved with by the time he was approached by the Major. Jack Leibowitz, also a Jewish immigrant, born in 1900 in Ukraine, and his family had moved, just like Donenfeld's, when he was very small, and wound up living in New York City. Leibowitz was in many ways the opposite of Harry Donenfeld. He was not flighty, he was not high-flying, he was down to earth, hard-working, very studious, applied himself, became an accountant, and was a pretty good accountant. Wound up with, as his client, a union, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, in the 1920s, and he was a very pro-union person. He had at that time kind of a socialist bent in his political views, and he was outspoken and hardworking on behalf of his union client and other union clients that he had. Kind of a true believer, if you will, until the Great Depression, when he lost most of his money and his job. At that point, his father, Julius Leibowitz, by the way, Jack, short for Jacob, and he was born Yakov Leibowitz. Julius Leibowitz had known Harry Donenfeld from the old neighborhood, and was friends with him, and he asked Harry Donenfeld to give Jack a job. He's a promising young man. And so he did. He brought Jack along initially as his accountant. Now, after Armour had basically gone out of business and Donenfeld had bought him out, he had brought Leibowitz on board in 1929. So he had been part of Donenfeld's operation for 3 years. At that point, it was Leibowitz that kind of kept the ship aright. Okay, this is something that Donenfeld had never had before. A competent business person, right? So Leibowitz was the number cruncher. He was sort of the guy who would go behind Donenfeld and sort of clean up after him and smooth any ruffled feathers that Donenfeld had stirred up. And Donenfeld's operation started to become more successful, and they were in a pretty good position when they were approached by the major, needing help to have his comic books to continue to be printed. Major Wheeler-Nicholson had been, by 1936, going through Donenfeld's printing company, which was called the Independent News Company, to not only print his comic books but also to distribute them. And, like I said earlier, they had not been selling that well. So he was already in the hole with Donenfeld when he came to him with the idea for a third title, Detective Comics, which the major was convinced this is the one that was going to do it. This is the one that was going to help him turn the corner. However, Donenfeld had a lot of leverage over him because he was so much in the red with Donenfeld. And so a condition was placed that Donenfeld's company would only print and distribute this third title if it were under the auspices of a whole newly created company in which the major would have to accept as his partner Jack Leibowitz. And so that's what was done. And the new company was called Detective Comics Incorporated. All right, so the first issue then was released, and the comic did okay. There were several long-running serials in it. Siegel and Schuster had a couple in there as well, but the major's fortunes continued to decline because it didn't sell as well as he had hoped. He hadn't rounded that corner the way that he hoped he would. In 1938, early 1938, Harry Donenfeld, after having a discussion with the major about the the prospects of the comic book publishing business, encouraged him to take a vacation. And in fact, Donenfeld paid for the major and his wife to have a cruise to Cuba and to take advantage of that to work up some new ideas for new titles and new characters that perhaps would make the big difference. So Wheeler-Nicholson and his wife took their cruise, got back home, went to his offices in New York City, and found that the locks had been changed, and found that he was being sued by Harry Donenfeld for failure to pay his debts. And essentially what happened was that Donenfeld destroyed him. And since he had been sort of finagled into accepting Jack Leibowitz as his partner for Detective Comics, that was the in, since Leibowitz worked for Donenfeld to take over the whole thing, to take over National and Detective Comics. So the Major found himself out of a job and out of a career, left the comic book business, and turned his attention again to prose and to writing military history books and so forth. So now Donenfeld has this comic book operation completely in his court, but he wasn't really one to actually run the ventures, right? He was into gaining them. So Jack Leibowitz, the accountant, wound up essentially running Detective Comics. And if you haven't already guessed, and if you didn't already know, eventually Detective Comics is going to be shortened to DC Comics. That same year, Donenfeld and Leibowitz were approached by none other than Maxwell Gaines, who wanted to get out from under operating with Dell magazines and have his own comics publishing company with his own original properties. And he was offered the same deal that the Major had been offered. You have to take on Jack Leibowitz as a partner. And so he did, and All American Publications got its start. And by 1944, he was bought out. He was in a position where he could no longer continue, and Donenfeld and Leibowitz bought out All American and took over all of its properties. At least in the case, though, of Gaines, he wasn't so deeply in debt like the Major that he lost everything. He did have a little bit of starting capital from his sale of the company, with which he was able to start over again with a much smaller company, which he called Educational Comics, and would eventually be known as EC Comics. But that's a story for later.